Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about another consequence of the Mongol Empire. And so you can think of this as sort of following two tracks. We started with the Mongols, we linked them to Marco Polo, and then Polo, of course, to Columbus. And through Columbus, we've talked about his pitch and the maps that he consulted. We talked about the Columbian Exchange. And then we're also going to talk about some of the consequences of Columbus. Imperialism, number one, the colonization of the New World. And we're also going to talk about Atlantic slavery. But here in this lecture, I want to follow a different track from the Mongols. We talked about the significance of the Mongols is that they unified a large portion of Eurasia and that they created a system of safe and fairly quick travel back and forth across this vast continent. Well, they inadvertently created through this system a means by which the flea, which carries the bubonic plague bacteria, the flea managed to hitch a ride with the Mongols and their livestock. And this flea infected both China and India, Persia, Mesopotamia, and Europe, causing one of the great die-offs in human history. So we're going to talk about the bubonic plague or the Black Death here for the next few minutes. I'm going to read you a quote here from a contemporary in 1348 to give you some sense of this catastrophe. We need to mention significance. We're going to talk about social consequences of the plague, the impact it has on European society. We'll talk about remedies, and then we'll conclude. So, significance first. This is one of the great demographic disasters in human history. I've read different accounts, and these numbers tend to keep going up as we go forward. It used to be a quarter, and then it was a third, and now the numbers are going up to even more than that. Of the human population of Eurasia being wiped out by this catastrophe. We're going to focus on Europe here because this is a Western Civ. Here's a quote from 1348. This is the height of the initial outbreak of the plague in Europe. And this gentleman writes, he says, quote, "And in many places in Siena, great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of the dead. And they died by the hundreds, both day and night. And their corpses are thrown into ditches and covered with earth. And as soon as these ditches were filled, more were dug. I buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those corpses that were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs and pigs dragged them forth and devoured their bodies throughout the city streets. There was no one to weep for the dead, for all awaited death. And so many died, we believed it was the end of the world." Unquote. I think this gives you some notion of the social impact and the psychological damage that this catastrophe caused. Can you imagine if half of your associates and peers and family members, colleagues, were suddenly dead within 2 weeks? It would be psychologically a challenge unlike anything you've ever faced. And then also imagine living in the 14th century where civic infrastructure is either non-existent or minimal. There are no funeral homes. There's no organized civic structure to confront a challenge of this size. So corpses are rotting in the streets. People are abandoning their homes because of corpses. Corpses are thrown into bodies of water. Now, I want to talk about social consequences specifically here. And first, the church, the esteem for the church is going to be diminished. Many priests are going to refuse to go to the homes of the dying to deliver the last rites. This is a sacrament of the Catholic Church and is regarded with the utmost importance. Yet priests are often afraid to come to your house to give the last rites to your dying husband or wife or children or mother or father. The priest apparently has no more faith than you do. And this, of course, causes some skepticism in the minds of people regarding the church. Doctors, too, face the same dilemma. Medieval medicine is nothing to write home about. Everything seems to begin and end with leeches. There's a lot of cliches about this. Doctors, like priests, are fearful of coming to your home. Again, there's this idea that it's the stench of the rotting bodies that causes you to get sick. So if we can avoid the stench, perhaps we can avoid the illness. Of course, the best way to avoid the stench is to stay away from these bodies that are slowly turning purple and then black with these buboes, bubonic plague. The bubo is a tumor-like protuberance that emerges in your neck, under your arms, behind your knees, and your groin. And again, these will turn dark purple and black before they burst. And this is accompanied by essentially your body rotting away, and the stench is apparently unbearable. Another social consequence, dead bodies are simply discarded, thrown into the streets, thrown into waterways, left into homes. Homes are abandoned. Again, the idea is to get away from the stench of these bodies. And you can imagine bodies in the streets being, like this other gentleman said, being devoured by dogs and pigs. There simply isn't a civic infrastructure to take care of this kind of problem. Other social consequences, whole villages wiped out in the space of a couple of weeks. Whole families disappear from the face of the earth in a very short time. Another social consequence of the plague is that it does not bring people together to console one another. It tends to drive people apart. And again, this goes back to the notion of escaping the stench of rotting bodies. If we can do that, perhaps we can escape death. Other social consequences, we have famine on top of the plague. This is obvious why. There's a dearth of agricultural workers to bring in the harvest. I know this sounds strange to the modern ear, but in the 14th century in Europe, if the harvest is not brought in successfully, then you starve. There are no restaurants. There are no drive-thrus. If the harvest is not successful, then there will be mass death. So we have the plague on one hand, killing off agricultural workers, and then we have the wheat rotting in the field. And then finally, another social consequence is a breakdown in law and order. And this is interesting. Again, this goes to a sort of a mass psychology. People believe that they'll be dead in a couple of weeks, so those things that used to restrain them earlier are now sort of abandoned. People figure, well, we're going to be dead in 10 days anyway, so we might as well do as we wish. So those things that you might otherwise have avoided earlier, you now indulge in. That accompanied with the fact that many people in positions of authority are killed by the plague. So there's a bit of social chaos here. Now, let's talk about remedies. A third to half of the population is dying off. There has to be a reason why. And you have to remember, this is before the microscope and the identification of bacteria and viruses and germs. These things simply didn't exist for medieval Europeans. So what is causing this massive die-off? Remedies. The first one is one we've already touched on. Flight. Get away from the city. Get away from people. Isolate yourselves. Many people would flee the cities, go to the woods, go to the ocean, try to isolate themselves, get themselves away from the stench of these bodies. You can see this in a famous book published by Boccaccio called The Decameron. That simply means the 100. It refers to 100 stories. As a group of people, I believe, flee Florence. And they go up into the hillsides and they build a fire and they sit around the fire eating and drinking and telling stories while they await death. If you take European literature, you may get a chance to read this book. Other remedies, we can put a few of these under the larger heading of aromatics, aroma being the root here. The idea is if the stench of the plague is going to cause you to get sick and die, then perhaps we can mask or block the stench of the plague with something that smells sweet. So you'll see an image here of a medieval doctor with completely covered head to toe. You see the mask. You see the long beak that he's wearing. This beak is stuffed with rose petals or with herbs, thyme, rosemary, something to mask the stench of the plague. Now, in theory, you could fight off the stench of the plague with something that smells nice, or if you buy into this aromatic idea, then I guess theoretically you could fight off the stench of the plague with something that smells worse. So people were known to bathe in their own urine. People were known to dip their clothing into the latrines and then wear them with the idea that the stench of their clothing now would fight off the stench of the plague. It sounds to me like the remedies are worse than the ailment. Other ideas, other remedies. Avoid violent exercise. It's believed that an overheated body is susceptible to the plague. Another remedy, purging the body. Here we induce both vomiting and diarrhea, the idea being that perhaps whatever this deadly thing is in us, perhaps we can eject it through purging. And of course, this is a very dangerous remedy. If you continue this for a few days, you're going to dehydrate and die in that way. So again, the remedy being equally as dangerous as the ailment. In the Pope's quarters in the Vatican, fires were created, and the smoke, the idea here was that the smoke would form a screen between the Pope and the possibility of the plague. And indeed this did work, although not for the reasons they assumed. The smoke, of course, kept the fleas away. And there's no notion in the European mind that it's the fleas that's causing this problem. But nevertheless, fleas don't like smoke, and this kept the Pope safe. Now, my favorite of these remedies is the Flagellants. The Flagellants would gather themselves in a parade, and this comes from the French verb flagell, to whip. They strip themselves, wear crowns of thorns, carry crosses, either whip themselves or whip the person in front of them, while the person behind you whips you in the back. And they would parade from village to village, seeking public penance from God, demonstrating to God that we're punishing ourselves for our sins. It's not necessary for you to punish us further by inflicting the plague upon us. So here we have a remedy that points to God as the cause of the mass death. And again, the Christian God had wiped out, or at least the Hebrew God had wiped out the world once before with the flood. So it's conceivable that he could be doing it again. And so the flagellant movement is the performance of public penance to prevent or to persuade God to spare us. So this is just a quick overview of the bubonic plague. Remember again that it is spread inadvertently by the Mongols as they overrun Eurasia from the Pacific all the way to Hungary, all the way to the Mediterranean. The plague, we believe it starts, for Europe at least, in the Black Sea, ships sailing through the Bosporus back to Sicily, and where the plague begins to take root, and then it moves northward through Italy, and then further north across the Alps until it infects much of the rest of Europe. So I'm going to stop there, and then when we return, we're going to pick back up again with the Age of Exploration. Thank you.